Hello and welcome to the Recommerce podcast, the podcast where we talk all things Recommerce and circular businesses. Like always, I'm joined by Tuomo Laine, the CEO and co-founder of Twice Commerce. Welcome.
Thank you, Karri.
Today we are comparing Recommerce operating systems, so Recommerce OS, with vertical solutions such as rental software. We're going to dive deep into how they differ in ways of functionality and the approach they were built and how they are thinking about API connectivity, expansion to multiple business models, and how they might work in the world of AI. Let's start by just defining, so what is operating system?
I think when it comes to an operating system, it's about having a set of primitives that work for multiple use cases. In an operating system, you have a way of thinking where these primitives, which in our case in commerce might be things like stock items and listings and collections and customers and maybe orders, are defined in a way that they enable many different commerce models to be built on top of that, or kind of that they can support many different models. So they try to be less opinionated in the way how they have been set. So for example, if we're talking about a stock item, let's say it's been set in a way that it doesn't assume that I'm gonna only be rented, thus I have all of these fields that are only rental specific. Rather, it's been built in a way that it assumes that, all right, I might be going around places, so I have like a timeline, but it might be maintenance, it might be an order, it might be, I don't know, stock transfer. Stock transfers might happen in a linear commerce also. And it might assume that some information about my usage or what I am is stored into this primitive. But again, it's not saying that it needs to be a thing called condition or it needs to be a thing called rental hours. So to simplify, I think in a commerce OS, whoever is building that is trying to define primitives that work horizontally in many use cases, support those, enable all of the needed information to be stored, but tries to avoid being very opinionated on what kind of information needs to be stored.
And how does that then compare to a vertical software? So maybe for simplicity, we can focus on, for example, rental software.
So for vertical software, then you still have a thing like stock item, but since you're building this large, like more narrow assumption that this is now a stock item that is only to be rented, for example, and the vertical might not only be a business model, it might be, I don't know, for example, AV and video equipment. So if the kind of software knows that there's only rentable AV video equipment stock items in this system, they might hard code in data values that are only relevant there to that category, like I don't know, connection types to cords and all of these things that might not be relevant to a bike, for example. And there might be features that are only relevant for that industry and that rental use case that have like become almost like a button or some kind of feature inside the software that might help that narrower use case, but for anyone else it might become confusing or similar. If we go back into what rental, so what Twice used to be called, was in the early days, and we might have said things like the ability to ask information from the customers, and we had predefined things like shoe size or kind of for ski industry for shoe size and age and experience level as set of things that might be asked from the customer. That was a very vertical software kind of a way of building something, because for those specific merchants it was very useful, but someone coming outside of that industry but still wanting to rent, it was very confusing. Why would I ask my customer for their shoe size? It makes no sense if I'm, I don't know, renting power tools. So I think that's the difference. So it's putting on the effort of when it comes to like difference of commerce OS to a vertical software, how you kind of define your primitives and whether you enable your software to work for multiple industries and multiple use cases.
Maybe on a high level before we go into the specific features, like how does this then show up for the user, or why would somebody, for example, build rental specific solution or choose it over a commerce OS? Because it sounds like it's a lot more flexible, but maybe it's bringing a little bit more complexity or something on.
Yeah, I think we have to kind of look into this, like what it was maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago and what the world looks like now. Well, first of all, there aren't that many commerce OSs in the market that would be approachable and well designed for a smaller merchant. And the reason for that is that building a commerce OS is a very complex exercise. It takes a lot of thought and it is very, very hard to build the flexibility and to kind of the infrastructure and all of those kind of primitives and defining those primitives in a way that they don't, they aren't too opinionated, but they don't become too generic either. So I think there's for every commerce OS, there's probably like, I don't know, 50 vertical softwares, because then it is so much more harder to build OSS than it is to build a vertical software. Now, why would someone then build a vertical software or use that is that if we go back 10 years, it was kind of hard to also build those commerce OSs, and it was easier to build like vertical SaaS for a niche category, and then to kind of serve that category. I think the challenge usually there was that if you build a vertical software for a smaller niche, let's say bike rentals, the market might not be enough to kind of allow you to build the best of the class software. You might be able to build good enough, but I don't know whether it would ever be able to grow to be best of the class. So then a commerce OS's challenge, I think, is that even though you've done the exercise of building a very flexible system, it still needs to make sense for the customer, for their use case. And that's where the art of like, how does it kind of auto set up itself? If you're installing Windows or if you're installing, I don't know, Apple OS or Mac OS, there's usually some level of onboarding and customization, some questions, like basic stuff, almost like what's your language, what's your region, do you want these things to be set up, and what's your, I don't know, default browser. So, and those are exercises where that more flexible OS tries to kind of set itself up for success and to be kind of catered to your needs. And that is something that also commerce OSs need to do. Even though they've built their capabilities to be very flexible, you can build a lot of use cases there, even though if you start with one use case, for example, rentals, with the commerce OS, it's very flexible for you to kind of start selling your items and such. It's kind of that all of that horizontal scalability is in play. But for that very initial setup, usually companies like us, we try to make it so that in your sign-up flow, you kind of define a bit who you are and what you're trying to achieve, so that we can set the software with sensible defaults that make the use cases and the relationship of primitives more understandable. But that's really probably the challenge. So whereas with the vertical software, you would kind of land already into a very opinionated software telling you this is how you run your rental shop. It's very, very nice UX if that happens to be the way how you want to run your business. The challenging parts start when you want to do something different than what the software assumes. So then you start to kind of fight against the software. And then usually you end up in an article, like a support article that tells you not how to achieve something, but tells you how to run your business, because it's their opinion on how you should do it, and that's how the software has been built. So instead of having tools that help to accustom to your processes, you kind of start to turn your processes to be something that can be run on the software. So I think those are the challenges. So vertical software has its benefits if it happens to very well match with your process, and then commerce OS needs to put a lot of effort into helping you set up the sensible default so that you don't have to learn the OS from ground up, but it feels familiar from the first usage.
Makes sense. Like if you, for example, compare operating systems or not compare, but look at like your Mac and my Mac, they are kind of set up differently for there's different applications and so on. So sounds like OS is kind of built in that it's gonna adapt to you and how you wanna run it. And I assume that that's something that maybe a little bit more mature, larger customers kind of appreciate when they already have their operations or they know where they want to kind of make it better or they have some part where they want to optimize things. And for them, probably OS is like the way to go and maybe see a little bit more effort to actually get everything up and running. What about like new entrepreneurs? If somebody's just starting out, for example, rental business and maybe don't have that experience, is maybe vertical solution is something that can actually help them like, hey, this is how you actually run a rental business if you don't have that experience.
Yeah, I would say so. It is a one way of like trying to figure out, okay, this is one opinionated way how to do it. If I just build everything according to how the system says that I should do it, you probably are going to end up in a somewhat good place. I would say so. I would still say that doing a little bit of promotion for Twice is that for a commerce OS, like a Recommerce OS for like Twice, our goal is to put in the kind of effort and help you that even though you come to an OS as a new, you kind of tell that I'm a new entrepreneur, my business idea is around bikes and renting out bikes, we can then help to set up that account to be such. So your inventory might have some sensible defaults when it comes to like inventory articles. Okay, there's the like number of how many times this bikes has been rented, and kind of we can customize the environment already to be like bike specific, almost like if you nowadays go to build a website to a service like Wix.com. It used to be sign up for Wix or whatever provider, then let me browse some themes. Hopefully some of these look somewhat like what I have in my mind, and let me then go from there. Now, this is where I think when I was saying that let's look how it was 5 years ago and how it's now, this is where things like AI has changed things quite a lot. So nowadays, Wix can just ask you with a text box, what is it that you're planning on building? And then you can say that I'm a new entrepreneur, I'm launching a bike rental business, Lake Tahoe. All right. And then that AI agent can take kind of the Wix's as kind of website OS or whatever and try to kind of already set up that to be very according to your needs. Similar things what we're doing now with then Twice with the onboarding is that you could quite openly say what you're trying to achieve, and then AI agents can help you set up everything. And that's where I think the OS layer really is the way to go forward, because the technology is there to allow easy customization of OS for your specific use cases, because it used to be quite hard. Now it's becoming easier with AI agents. With vertical software, it's a very narrow path which you customize. It's kind of usually on a level that what do you want to see on your dashboard, kind of the number of rentals or the number of orders next week. But it's that the customization is a lot more narrow in those cases.
Okay, so if I get it right, it's that by default the OS might be a little bit more complex because it's not defining like, hey, this is how you run, this is what your item looks like, this is all the properties, but AI is kind of enabling you to customize it and kind of maybe get it to the same place that some opinionated vertical software. Let's say that the AI helps you get into the same place as a vertical solution, but going forward from there, what is the benefit of going with OS rather than with vertical solutions? So I assume that the vertical solution, when it's designed for a specific task, it has some limitations if you want to go forward and maybe expand into new product categories or new business models or similar.
So the benefit of being set up on top of a commerce OS when your business matures is that usually when your business matures, your needs mature and you get new ideas. You wanna start selling your rental fleet at the end of the life cycle, or maybe just wanna start accepting some, I don't know, trade-ins and then kind of refurbishing those with the repair operation that you have for your rentals and kind of launching a repair service. If you've been set up for on top of a commerce OS, likely you can just keep running with the same software, just tweak some things a little. If you are on a very vertical specific, for example, rental software, all of a sudden you will find yourself in the kind of market that I need to find a maintenance software, or I need to find some other software then for this new need. And as you kind of continue this game, you will kind of be adding a lot of different vertically specific software. And especially in those moments when you're kind of expanding your business, usually the kind of first steps that you need to take aren't so hard that a Commerce OS couldn't pull it off. So it might be maybe a bit too much to take a vertical specific solution for that specific need that you just have, like launching a maintenance tracking. So I think the benefit comes from the fact that with an OS, you're more flexible to experiment, more flexible to tweak it as your operation grows, whether it's in the number of locations or number of sales channels or inventory size or how you want to track your inventory. All of this is very flexible. There will be, of course, times when you kind of something might grow to a level where you want, I don't know, a custom integration, for example. Well, due to the fact that Commerce OS has usually put so much effort into figuring out the primitives and how they work, and that comes with the job of building very good APIs. If you need to extend the Commerce OS with some custom software piece, for example, it is usually achievable because, again, all of that hard work that was put into kind of defining the Commerce OS as a less opinionated tool allows you to kind of build the opinions on top of it with custom code and so on. Whereas, again, with vertically specific software, even though they might have APIs, but the data itself, underlying data, might be so opinionated that it's hard to get like the data that you need because they're kind of serving only opinionated data. Again, something I think that we as a company have transformed over time. Early days, like if you looked at the data that our APIs were spilling out, it was quite opinionated. It was kind of our take on what an order should have. Whereas as we've been maturing and becoming more of an OS, also the underlying data has become less opinionated with the hope that it can serve customers better in these custom use cases.
So it sounds like with vertical solutions, you kind of end up doing these workarounds. You are using maybe something not the way it was kind of intended to use, some kind of, let's say, like a comment field in an order might be something where you actually track some kind of like order status changes or something like that. But in the OS world, you might be able to kind of set up like, hey, I want to have this type of property in my OS, and then you actually use it and it's more available for custom integrations and so on.
Definitely. And that's why I think like a new entrepreneur is kind of safer to go with a Commerce OS that has been like on a high level built on the same assumptions that they're running. If you're a re-commerce entrepreneur, Twice is pretty good solution because we're a re-commerce OS. So there are some of these assumptions of, hey, items might be flowing back and forth and orders are not like linear, they're circular, and stock items have more status than out of stock and in stock. And then if you need to build something, you can build small purposeful software solutions. And again, in the age of AI, if you have these small things that you need to achieve, you can nowadays actually like vibe code that thing or build your own custom agent for it, like with make.com or something that is actually pretty good at doing that. You might be able to do it in like an afternoon yourself. You just give it the endpoints of the OS, or if it has like an MCP layer, the agent will probably be able to fetch the data and pull off the job that you need to do for that niche thing pretty well. So I think it might be a little bit of a thing of the past that every small thing needs to become its own vertical SaaS solution. I think it's probably more meaningful that we have these smaller custom-made apps, for example.
Okay, maybe before we jump into the AI and this kind of like new era or current era nowadays, this AI nativeness, let's maybe talk a little bit more about the API and the connectivity. Like, how is that built into the Commerce OS?
Well, it's an art form and a skill by itself, but and I by far I'm not probably the most experienced it. But how I simplify it for myself is that with the OS layer, I think, or the OS approach, we mentioned earlier these primitives. And to simplify, we could say that the primitives are now like your inventory, so your stock items, your listings, your customers, and your orders. Now, with the Commerce OS, the API connectivity, I think the first step always is to make sure that someone has access kind of to the raw data. They can create a primitive themselves with an API. They can fetch the primitive with the API, or then they can edit the primitive with an API. Then at that point, we've achieved a place where the Commerce OS is providing kind of a graphical user interface to do the same jobs, but also to kind of view your primitive data. But if you connected your OS to a different system, it's very easy to kind of pull off these simple jobs. Now, the more we start to then add services to the API, it usually means that we acknowledge some jobs between the primitives or relationships between the primitives. For example, an order is a thing that connects many of the primitives under one thing. It's a order usually has a customer, order usually has some listings, and those listings are somehow connected to stock items, and maybe a payment is a primitive that is there. Then to that, Commerce OS can kind of start adding APIs that are less about creating raw data or fetching raw data, but more about doing an actual service or a job, which might be, I don't know, refund this listing or something. And then I think that's again on its own level, the Commerce OS is trying to figure out very primitive jobs that can be triggered or listened to by webhooks and APIs. But yeah, I think that's the approach. Now, if with vertical software, I think there are similar approaches probably, but all of those, like fetching of the data, so the data itself is very opinionated, so it makes that like basic API connection quite opinionated and in some cases less useful. And if they productize these more job-related API things, those are also very opinionated, which can make it harder to just like listen to some events or similar to that, where you want to get like not so opinionated data out of. I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of my thinking around it. So that's how kind of the API layers are built and servitized. And with the Commerce OS, kind of again, all of the work of spending that extra effort in trying to make sure that your data is not opinionated too much. So it always leaves us under some kind of umbrella. We are operating under the umbrella of commerce. So you try to build everything in a internationally non-opinionated way. And that work, hard work, comes to kind of, or builds its value when someone is tapping into the API.
Maybe you have a bit more concrete example of this. So what comes to my mind that it's related to Recommerce is, for example, some type of inspection or maintenance process. So how does that compare when you are trying to maybe integrate some third-party solution, or maybe something that you actually build yourself, like let's say just a dumb form that you are kind of filling in when you are doing some kind of inspection and getting that data into Commerce or Recommerce OS compared to vertical software?
On an OS level, let's start with the idea that an inspection is just an event at a stock item's life cycle or the timeline, or however you want to call it. The Commerce OS might not have a thing called inspection in its ecosystem. It can be whatever the customer has defined it to be. So that's, I think, already the first thing. So instead of you, if you have a custom form that you want to connect to the OS, instead of you having to listen to a webhook or something called inspection, you are listening to something more primitive like an order ended, or allows you to have a more freedom because the OS doesn't assume that there is a thing called inspection after, after a order ends or something like that. So you can name it however you want it, whether it's an inspection or whether it's automated maintenance and all of that. So you can kind of create these events more flexibly. Then the other part is that if you have a custom form that you want that your employees, for example, fill, that all of that information gets attached to the stock item at that given right timestamp. A Commerce OS assumes that this event can have a custom payload or custom information. It doesn't say that, all right, now that you save data to this place, can you give me inspection condition, inspection cost, all of this is kind of free form, and it's kind of based on you what you want to store there. There's value in that, in meaning that you can build what kind of forms you want, and you don't have to kind of, if your inspection process is very specific, you can be 100% sure that you can store all of the data that you need to the actual stock item. The other side of the coin might be that if you, one employee, or you have two different forms or two different old versions of the form, that the software itself doesn't necessarily protect that hey, all of the inspection information needs to be in the same structure. So it becomes also less opinionated in securing your data when it comes to like whether everything looks like the same between two events. So there are of course trade-offs. So Commerce OS do less work for you in standardization. It's usually then if you connect these custom forms or similar, it's kind of your job in that part of the ecosystem to make sure that the data is in the right format.
So if I get it right, in Recommerce OS, for example, in Twice, there is this primitive called like a inventory article event that you can use for a lot of things. And then on the vertical software side, in order for you to maybe input some maintenance or inspection, there has to be this kind of predefined ability in the API that, hey, here is how you can put maintenance things. But in Twice and maybe other Recommerce OSs as well, you can basically put whatever you want, and you make the decision that this is called maintenance and this is the information that it has.
Yeah, that's kind of the simplified way to put it. Most likely vertical software could enable the same behaviors, but they rarely do due to the nature. But yeah, that's the thing, that you can store a lot more flexible data there, and you can name it however you want. I think a car rental is a good example that you might have things like inspections, you might have things like maintenance, but you might have things like just a GPS tracker logging, where is this car now? Because you might want to make sure that it didn't, for example, exit the state or nation borders. So in a Commerce OS, it's probably quite easy to ping this data to the stock item automatically. So you know that in this kind of source of truth of my inventory, where I have all of my stock items, all of my cars, I can go to any car and just see a track of the GPS pings, that where has it moved. Now, what the Commerce OS probably doesn't do, it doesn't automatically create an alarm that, hey, the car left the state. So that would again be something that you pull off in your own solution, because again, the Commerce OS is less opinionated. It doesn't have an opinion called the car needs to stay inside the state borders, but it has all of the data for someone to deduce whether this has happened. So that's where you would build your custom solution. First of all, the one that pings the GPS data in, and the solution, which can be the same thing, that reads that data and then creates an alarm if that longitude, latitude happens to be outside of state borders. But again, this is something where the flexibility of you pulling off the job like you want comes into play. And then you still have a let's say, Commerce OS, the kind of very source of truth and the kind of home of things where you can go, where you know where all of your assets are tracked. So all of your stock items are there. You kind of, in that context, can see everything that has happened to them. You can see all of the kind of states and where they've been and where they're going. And you can see how you productize them via listings, and you can see all of the customers that engage with those. So you have a nice home base for your business operations. But then when you go to more specialized jobs, you're kind of just connecting to that rather than being limited by the capabilities of the OS.
So it sounds like the OS world is enabling you to do almost anything, but it's not maybe doing a lot of those things on behalf of you.
Yeah, it's enabling a lot, but it's not, yeah, exactly. It's not kind of automatically doing those things for you. And you can be pretty sure that if it's like an industry specific thing, the OS doesn't know it by heart. Probably doesn't have that like checkbox of make sure my stock items do not leave state borders. So that's kind of a feature that you wouldn't probably see now. OS, unless the OS has enabled, for example, an app store or similar that allows then others to kind of standardize their custom solutions, then you might see this kind of that you install an app called Vehicle Tracker 3.0, and then that brings this little checkbox to the OS where you can click it.
Okay, so maybe the App Store is a good example of like, if there is an App Store, there is most likely some type of operating system logic behind it, where in this case, the app creator can actually do these things on top of the OS. So it's more like a platform.
Yeah, definitely. But I think this is also where in our context, like things like great partners come into play. We have partners like Click and Share that specialize in automated self-service rentals, like cold pickups and cold returns and smart locks and so on. And they're very good at figuring out your use case, that specific self-service use case. And for their benefit, they get to use twice as part of their solution, so they don't have to solve all of these kind of commerce primitives. They can focus on that one part that is very important for them, which is how does the kind of automation with locks and lockers and the items work, and some like customer messaging related to that. But the overall business logic and everything from like accounting reports and online storefronts and all of these is handled by the Commerce OS. So, and I think this is also how we see it, that the world of business and the world of commerce is such that everyone shares maybe 60 to 80% of the needs, but the 20 are so different that it's probably best to build capabilities that allow people to customize the solution themselves, or then to partner with agencies or providers that are specialized in something. And I think in commerce, it's usually also, it's not only software, it's a combination of hardware, software. So for example, Click and Share has been testing and working with many actual smart locks hardwares that they have. So it's their professionalism in knowing what's the best solution out there for this use case at any given time, which would be impossible for a kind of commerce software company to keep track of all of this at any given moment. Waivers might be another thing that is super similar, very national, very differentiating between even state borders. I think that's where the interplay of partners, for example, comes into play, and what's the benefit of a Commerce OS to partner companies.
Sounds really good and maybe future-proof, and maybe a good segue into how do you see that the current status with AI and maybe going couple of years into the future, and there's been this kind of discussion, like, do you even have these fixed standard user interfaces anymore, or is it something that you just need to have the data in a really good, easy to use layer for an AI, and maybe it kind of spins out user interface based on the current job to be done?
Yeah, so let's think about, let's stay in the rentals just to kind of have a continuous example, but how do you want to book stuff out of a rental shop? There's different user interfaces already now in the world. You can just send an email, open text, and tell what you want. You can call them, in voice, tell what you need, and interact there. Or you can go to this kind of interactive catalog called Online Store, where you can click and build a basket and check out the basket and all of this, and probably a few others. Now, as the world has progressed towards AI, many of those things can be pulled off with like an AI agent. So I could go through a discussion with ChatGPT saying, first of all, what do I need? And they can recommend me some providers, and I could kind of say that, well, I'm looking for this kind of stuff, and the agent can actually do the facilitation there. Or the shop itself might have, instead of a human answering the phone, it might have an AI, like AI customer assistant there going through that interaction. So what I mean to say there is that a vertical software solution probably can be a bit less capable of pulling off these kind of fuzzier jobs where you're not in full control of the customer path or the user path. Because if I'm having a discussion with you in voice, you cannot really control my next choice that well. So an OS is maybe more capable of helping the AI agent to kind of tap into relevant data points to try to serve you in the best way as possible. Whereas with a vertical software, they might be a bit more limited.
Okay. So part of the OS's infrastructure and kind of keeping everything open and accessible to the AI, it's kind of ready to the future, whatever it might actually look like, while the vertical solutions might be like limited that, hey, there is, once again, only these things are available and these are available, and maybe not playing that much well together with the AI interface that we probably don't even know what it's going to be in 5 years.
Yeah, definitely. I think most of the things are just, data tables that have well-designed data schemas that then enable things like AI agents then to pull off their job, whatever they're hired to do, whether it's an internal or customer-facing job or similar, or whether it's spinning out a user interface for someone to buy something. But I think the world is more in the place where it's very important that you have these primitives stored in a accessible and open way that you can, if needed, bring them to the context of a partner or an AI agent that you've spinned out yourself, because that's really the future-proof way of doing things.
Okay. Maybe to the end, you also have experience by first building this vertical rental software called Rental and now moving into the Recommerce OS space. Do you see that there is still some use case or some situation where some type of a business should actually maybe choose vertical software over a Recommerce OS?
No. No, but yeah, but seriously, it's hard to see it. I think at least on a business model level, no. I don't see that you should select only rental software. For that, I cannot really come up with any good reasons. I'm sure that there are niche industries where you will need something that I'm not aware of. When it comes to whether you should have a vertical software whose vertical is rentals, no, I don't think that makes sense anymore. That's in the same way as it wouldn't probably make sense to have a, pick pack ship software only. It probably would be good to have that connected to some other primitives also.
All right. But hey, thank you a lot for your insights. I think this was really interesting deep dive into the world of Recommerce operating systems and vertical softwares.
Thank you so much, Karri.